A U.S. Department of Justice request for voter data is facing some pushback in Nebraska. Good evening, I'm Brian Mastery.
And I'm Aaron Sullivan. An organization is filing suit to stop the Secretary of State from releasing the information to the DOJ. The DOJ says it needs to make sure voter registration records are accurate and secure.
Now, the data it's telling states to hand over includes voters' full names, their birthdays, addresses, driver's license numbers, and partial social security numbers.
First Alert 6's Zena Taher joins us live in the studio with the latest on this lawsuit. Zena?
Yeah, Aaron, Brian, there's going to be a hearing on this lawsuit in Nebraska next Thursday. So it's an important step because a judge is going to decide whether to force the Secretary of State to hold off from releasing that voter information to the DOJ. Voting rights groups here in the state say the federal government needs to stay out of handling that kind of sensitive data. The U.S. Department of Justice's request for voter information in Nebraska is raising red flags.
We were seeing voters from both sides, from, regardless of political affiliation and background and political ideology, saying that they did not feel that this was information that needed to be released.
That's Nancy Petito with Civic Nebraska, a nonprofit aiming to up voter engagement. She and other voting rights groups worry gathering voter data into one federal database could make it a target for hacking. Gavin Geis with Common Cause says currently voter data is accessible, but not en masse.
And so it's just different procedures in terms of releasing an entire file versus controlling it here in Nebraska, or releasing a limited list. Like I said, anyone can request, just two very different sets of data.
He says this would be the first time there's a federal voter database only accessible to government officials. Common Cause filed a lawsuit to stop the Nebraska Secretary of State Bob Evnen from releasing voter information to the DOJ in February as planned. Evnen says the Department of Justice has the authority to demand voter data. He provided a statement on his actions saying in part, quote, "There are federal and state privacy laws that affect how the DOJ can handle this information. We'll remind them of those duties when we provide the data, and I'm confident they will honor those requirements." Evnen does say he's confident Nebraska's voter list is accurately maintained. Voter advocates say that's exactly what makes the release of the information unnecessary.
We really feel as an organization that releasing this data would really undermine the trust that our voters have, and we want to ensure that that is kept private.
So here's what's happening next. Secretary Evnen plans to release voter data on February 12th. Common Cause is trying to block that release with an injunction scheduled to be considered by a judge next Thursday. So if that injunction passes, Common Cause will keep fighting the action in court, and that February 12th release won't happen. In the studio, Zena Taher, First Alert 6.
Thanks for the explainer, Zena. Powerful winds dominate